Good evening and welcome to the Legion Cantina. In today's episode, we'll be looking at the various factions in Star Wars Legion and which of them are currently winning the most games. So, on your screens now will be a couple of tables that I've pulled from Longshanks. So, I've set two filters for these. The first table is sort of pre-Anakin Clone Commando arc nerf, so from August last year to November last year, and then the second table is sort of post nerf, so the data from November last year up until sort of current date March 2025. And in these tables there's a bunch of different data. We can see the number of games played, wins, losses, draws, and the win percentage. Now for what I'm going to be looking at, the only things I'm really going to focus on are the number of games played and the win percentages before and after the nerf. So let's look at win percentages first, because I think that's probably what people are a bit more interested in. We'll look at games played later, but win percentages first. So pre-nerf, Gar was a long way ahead, more than 5% clear of CIS in second. Rebels coming in at the 50-50 in third, and then Shadow Collective and Empire languishing down at 44% in fourth and fifth. Not a surprise to anybody. I think worth noting with the Longshanks data, like obviously there are sometimes errors in the way people input them. These aren't always super competitive games and all the various things and stuff like that. But on a sample size of, I think, almost 10,000 games, I think it's a pretty reasonable sample to actually look at, and I definitely think the averages will kind of bear out across the data overall. So yeah, I think this kind of makes sense, and I think definitely pre Anakin and Clone Commando nerf, this kind of felt how it was playing out. Felt like Gar had a sort of significant advantage over everything else. Then moving down to the bottom, looking at the second table, you can see what happened as a result of the nerf to Gar. Basically, in very simple terms, all that really happened was that Gar and Rebels kind of switched places. Rebels moved from a 50% win rate, so pretty much even, up to 55%. So they got that nice 5% buff and moved up a couple of places. CIS went from a 51% win rate up to 54%. Obviously, remained second, and I think feels about right. Like, I think CIS always felt like the faction that was kind of best placed to challenge Gar, and I think Rebels have maybe had a slight edge over CIS, but I think arguably Rebels and CIS are pretty interchangeable at the top of the competitive rankings right now. Obviously, the big nerf we can see here was that the Gar win rate dropped by 8% and moved them down from first to third. And then Shadow Collective and Empire. Shadow Collective's win rate actually went up a little bit. Can't really explain this. I think also worth noting that the Shadow Collective sample size is about 20% the size, maybe a bit less of the others. So there's a lot more variance going on there. And then Empire remained exactly the same win rate and languishing down at the bottom. So yeah, I think this is kind of what you'd expect to see from the nerfs. I think Rebels did have a pretty poor matchup against Gar pre-nerf, and I think the matchup still isn't phenomenal, but there is just less Gar around, so it's less of an issue for Rebels to deal with. And Rebels do kind of have lots of tools to deal with almost anything as long as you set up your list correctly, kind of a bit of a Swiss Army knife in a lot of ways. In terms of games played, Gar is consistently towards the top and was definitely the most played faction pre-nerf. It did drop down below CIS after the nerf, so maybe a few sort of perhaps more competitively minded people moving away from Gar, but still definitely one of the more played factions. Shadow Collective right down at the bottom. Probably not a surprise, bit of a shame. You know, I have a soft spot for Shadow Collective, but I can understand why it's one of the least played. Rebels down at fourth for both was quite interesting, actually. I assumed Rebels and Empire would be at the top, but maybe that's just my preference for the original trilogy over the prequels, although prequels are an underrated masterpiece. But yeah, maybe the original trilogy is arguably slightly better. And then Empire had dropped from second to third, but again, I think not a whole lot to be seen in those sort of number of games played. The only kind of significant one for me is Gar moving from the most played down to the second most played. Then moving on to sort of looking at individual factions, and Longshanks actually produces a pretty nice graph here that you can see the kind of tracking the win rate over time, and then on all of these I'll superimpose the point at which the Gar nerf came in. If I'm feeling particularly vindictive, I'll also bring in the point that Aquas appeared, but maybe that's to dispel my agenda from the previous video. But yeah, you can see here is that Rebels have remained kind of relatively consistent. They definitely got a little bit of a helping hand following the Gar nerf. You can see that sort of uptick up to that kind of high 50s, nearly 60% win rate that they've had since then. And you can see that kind of 50% win rate that they had before. So yeah, I think you can see the kind of effect that Gar nerf had. A bit of a spike in games played. Again, you would probably expect a few people moving away from Gar maybe after the nerf, so perhaps moving over to Rebels and increasing the number of games played. It also gives you, long ranks also gives you access to data on the battle forces. Now, these win rates are just across the whole time, so from August up until March, but Echo-based defenders, about 50%, so again, a pretty standard Rebel win rate. But Bright-Tree Village up at 58%. I can't explain this one because Bright-Tree Village is not meta and doesn't seem particularly strong, but does seem to have quite a high win rate. It may just be that perhaps some more competitively minded people are taking it on as a bit of a fun list and actually guiding it to some strong results. But yeah, I can't really explain that one. That is quite a high win rate for what is not a particularly meta list right now. Then moving into second place, so currently it's Separatists who have the second highest win rate, and again you can see that sort of slight uptick following that Gar nerf, and it's kind of trended up again a little bit, and I'm not attributing that to Aquas, but you know what they say, correlation does imply causation. Again, just interesting to see, like, and again you can see that sort of spike in the number of Separatist games played, presumably following the Gar nerf, but I think perhaps sort of a less significant impact than there was on the Rebel faction. Basically, CIS has, I think, been really quite consistent throughout New Legion, 2.6 Legion. It's felt like always a strong list, and it was decent against the old version of Gar. It's one of the best ways to challenge it, and it's now fairly solid against Rebels as well. It's just a really solid list overall for me. Separatists, the invasion force, 50%, so not great. And again, the EXD is definitely more meta than Bright-Tree Village and has a higher win rate. I think it is probably the meta way, the best way arguably to run CIS, although I can see the Aquas Dooku thing maybe that you can run in standard Separatists also being quite strong. So again, that is just quite a high win rate for experimental droids. Again, these sample sizes are quite small, like 42 games with the invasion force and 86 with experimental. Like, these aren't huge sample sizes, so there is a fair bit of variance going on there. This was the graph that made me want to make this video. You can see how much that win rate has tanked following the Gar nerf. It was, knocking around, as I said earlier, kind of around that sort of 56, 57, definitely high 50s win percentage, and then that immediate drop down to that 50% win rate. And I think, to be fair, like, the data kind of backs up what you're sort of seeing in the meta right now. Like, I think there's definitely a space for Gar in that sort of, whether you're running 5.0 first, but it kind of all tends to pivot around that Anakin commandos, not commandos, ARC, sorry, type list that you see running around quite a lot. I think there have been a few Obi-Wan lists that have done quite well, and I think there is something in that sort of Obi-Wan Bad Batch type area that maybe is kind of interesting, just because re-rolling red searching defense die is always going to be really strong, and if you can get an army close to an objective and just resist damage, which that list seems to do quite well, I think maybe there's a space in there. But yeah, having some very, very powerful units taken away from them has obviously had the effect that you would expect to see on that win rate. And also you can see the number of games played has dropped off as well under that graph. In terms of the win rates from the battle forces across the whole time, this is 5.0 first at the top at a 61%, and then Wookiee Defenders also seems to have a fairly high win rate as well. Should be noted, for the battle forces we've looked at, most of them, like the rebel ones, had like 120, 130. The CS ones had sort of 40 to 80, not very many. 501st has 250 games played, and I think that does speak quite a lot to its popularity. Definitely pre-nerf, and you'd still see it knocking around post-nerf as well. It's still definitely a very valid list. So one of the more popular battle forces out there. Shadow Collective doesn't get any battle forces, it just is what it is. And its win rate is all over the place because the sample size is a lot smaller and so the variance is a lot higher. Again, there does seem to have been a little bit of an increase in games following the Gar nerf, but not that much. I think Shadow Collective just kind of does its own thing, right? Like it's not bothered about the drama affecting the other factions. It just kind of plods along doing its own thing. And I do wonder at some point if the right meta comes along that the scourge of Black Suns and the bus may return, but I think unfortunately they may just get left behind unless they get any new stuff. And it remained identical, 4th in win rate, 5th in games played, irrespective of what was going on around it. And finally, Empire, just that graph just remains almost completely flat and unaffected by the Gar nerf. It's bad, unfortunately. Empire right now, I think. The saving grace in some ways are the battle forces. I think Tempest is super interesting. I think Blizzard has options and Remnant, whatever. You can see from the number of games played that Remnant is maybe not super popular. But I do think Tempest, again, will just be an off-meta pick for a while. Like, if you ever see a meta where there is less armor running around, unfortunately not the meta we're in right now, then I think Tempest becomes a really useful army for people to have access to, and I think it will be always a valid pick as long as the units in it remain at least functional, because it does just do something so different to every other list in the game. So yeah, while the win rate of Empire overall is pretty bad, those win rates for the Battle Force at least are a little bit encouraging. So it's not all doom and gloom in Empire, except it pretty much is. Other stuff we're going to look at, we'll look at the primaries and secondaries and how many games were played for each of them, and then we'll come on to the advantages and red and blue win rates. So firstly, looking at the primaries and the secondaries, most played is Close the Pocket, which I think is kind of interesting. I guess it's maybe in some ways a bit of a default mission. It kind of is the most generic way, I think, to kind of approach New Legion, just because so much of it ends up being fights at range 2, and it is literally a scrap over the central objectives. So that kind of makes sense. Bunker Assault, yeah, I mean, I was interested by the difference between like Bunker Assault and Intercept, because there are some similarities in the way those tend to play out, at least for me. So yeah, the difference in those was a little bit surprising. Shifting down at the bottom, I think shifting is just quite weird and is kind of almost the opposite of Close the Pocket in a lot of ways. Like, obviously the objectives can move around so much, and you do need lots of different range bands to be competitive on that in that scenario. So maybe that's why shifting is like, again, for people who are trying to make gun lines work and stuff like that, maybe that's just one they have kind of floating around. Breakthrough is the one I think I end up playing the most, so I was a bit surprised to see it down in 4th place for the number of games played. But I think Breakthrough's really good. I really enjoy like the way that the deployment forces different kinds of engagements on Breakthrough. Like, there is the option to be really aggro early, but then you kind of trade off a bit of board control for, maybe attacking an opponent in a corner. Like, you can opt to hold your forces sort of quite centrally, but then again, you make it harder to actually compete for those objectives. So I think Breakthrough is a really interesting one. And I do think Close the Pocket's quite boring, but I can understand why it's at the top of the most games played. Moving over to the secondaries, Sweep and Clear. So it kind of makes sense, especially again, like with the way Legion is played now, like getting in your opponent's face, being quite aggressive. I was surprised it was as far ahead of the others as it is. Like, it's 1,000 games clear of any of the others, so that is quite interesting. But yeah, again, it makes sense, and I think Close the Pocket, Sweep and Clear, if you want to sum up, New Legion in a nutshell and oversimplify a bit, then maybe that's the way the game is kind of played now. Mark targets, recon, surface scan, these are all the generic ones that are all fairly similar in the sense, you pick a unit or a couple of units and they do a thing, and that makes a lot of sense to me why those are in the middle. I think those are kind of like fairly safe picks. And then destroy enemy base and bring them to heal are probably the kind of equivalent of like a shifting in the sense of the secondaries. Like they're kind of a little bit off meta. Like destroy enemy base is very aggressive for a secondary and almost plays a bit like a primary in some ways, because you normally end up with them kind of in a corner or something a bit further away. So yeah, that is an interesting one. And bring them to heal is an interesting one if you're planning, or if you're imagining you're going to run into a lot of droids or vehicles. So I can understand why that one's at the bottom, because if you're at a tournament and you assume even like one or maybe two of your games will be quite vehicle or droid heavy, then you're immediately at a disadvantage with that one. So I can see why, given the current meta involving a fair few vehicles and droids, that one's at the bottom. So again, that makes quite a lot of sense. No huge surprises here, apart from that sweep and clear being quite as high up as it was. This is what this is not even controversial. Like, anyone who's surprised by the data here needs to maybe take a look at the way they're building their battle deck. But yeah, we've got the advantages and then red versus blue win rate. So at the top for win rate is advanced intel, 60% win rate. If you're able to get this on your side, you objectively have an advantage, even if you are not a good player. As long as you actually use your pass token, you have an advantage. And it's very common, like, when that one gets flipped over, like, I think a lot of people are now like, oh, I need to look out for that one. And especially if you're a blue player, it's almost always going to be your first move if you see your opponent has that intel that you are going to flip that over, because having a pass token on turn one of the game is just insanely good and literally seems to buff your win rate by effectively 10% just by having it on your side, according to Longshanks. So ordnance then down at 50%. You can see the dominance of intel because it is leagues ahead of all the others in terms of its win rate. Ordnance is second, and I think makes sense. Like, it, even if you're not into armor, it offers some nice suppression. If you are into armor, though, and you use it in the right situation, it can be extremely strong and do some really nice wounds. And yeah, if nothing else, it can force your opponent to move away from an objective or something, and that is super valuable. So makes sense. And then, would you look at that? It's cunning deployment coming in third. Yeah, I mean, this one I think requires a little bit more planning ahead than intel, for instance. But again, as long as you're actually making use of those dodges on relatively sensible units, it makes a lot of sense. And yeah, only a 48% win rate, but I think given the dominance of intel from these percentages, 48% is actually fine in terms of cunning deployment. And those three are the most commonly taken. Are the most commonly taken ones in games I play in, and they are the three that appear most commonly in games as well. Fortified comes in fourth. Sure, like, if you want some heavy cover, fine. I mean, if you place this strategically and you've got a lot of units that can benefit from it, maybe. But yeah, I just don't see a reason currently, apart from weirdly Garrison, that I'll make an argument for later on, to take anything other than intel, cunning, and ordnance, because they just seem to cover all things pretty well between them. Strafing run just seems to be almost, not objectively, but very close to objectively worse than ordnance, especially right now where there's many vehicles and armor and whatever running around. So yeah, if you're running strafing run, probably cut it for ordnance. It's just a better option. And Garrison, I think Garrison is actually the hardest one of these to use well, but it does occasionally have a use, and it has a use on the occasions where there is a large LOS blocking area of terrain near the front of your deployment zone, and you have a large core unit that wants to get close to your opponent. Whether that's a large squad of fleets or large squad of clones with scattergun and fives, or if you're running big B2s, for instance, like that could be super nice. There's just some really niche, not really niche, there's some fairly niche options for when Garrison can be really good. And I think, while you can see here from the low win rate and stuff like that and the low number of games it appears in, I think there is an argument for Garrison definitely in the correct list over a strafing run or a fortified position. In terms of number of games, cunning deployment is the most common, then it's advanced intel, and then it's ordnance. I suspect a little bit of this is that people just probably aren't allowing advanced intel through, and it's getting chucked out in favour of a cunning or an ordnance. Because I imagine if you were to have this for the number of, if people were to enter their battle decks, almost all of them should ideally have advanced intel in, because it's always useful in every army. So I imagine it's just getting vetoed away quite a lot, especially given that 60% win rate. And then finally, red versus blue win rate. You get a 3% or 6% versus the red player buff for being blue player. Over 11,570 games, blue player had a 53% win rate, which is interesting and not what I had expected. Yeah, I can't explain this, because most of the time I would absolutely choose to be red player. So very interesting that apparently you get a buff for being blue player. But yeah, hopefully that was interesting. And yeah, it is just kind of interesting to see how things have fluctuated, like in the build up to the Gar nerf, and then looking at, post Gar nerf. That, effectively the Rebels and Gar have just kind of swapped, and CIS has just remained, to be fair, CIS, Shadow Collective and Empire have remained very consistent. It's just, the two problem children of Rebel Alliance and Gar kind of switching places who are the problem. So maybe Sleep Cell and ATRT nerf coming in soon to draw down those pesky rebels. But it is nice to see that at least there is less of a yawning chasm between the top win percentages than there used to be pre-Gar nerf. But yeah, let me know what you think in the comments below. I appreciate there are some shortcomings with the way that Longshanks, maybe people enter data into Longshanks and things like that. It's probably not all the most competitive games in the world, but I thought this was just interesting to have a look through. And on a sample size of 11,570, I think there's a bit of room for manoeuvre. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you for the next one.